I just want there to be this overall push worldwide to get, to close that gap, to bridge that gap, especially between, doctors my age and older that definitely didn't hear anything about it in our school and our training, all the way to ones now that hopefully are hearing something about it. But I don't want it to be to where you go to one doctor, they know everything about it, and you go to another doctor and those patients are not getting any information. Like, hopefully, as it spreads more and more, that's my goal, is that patients don't walk in to an appointment and their doctor stares at them like a deer in the headlights if they mention psychedelics, and they don't walk in and saying, I'm having all these, mental health issues, and psychedelics aren't mentioned. Like, my ultimate goal is that psychedelics are mentioned and everybody feels comfortable enough to have that conversation.
Hey listeners, and welcome back to Third Ways Podcast. Today we are joined by Dr. Lynn Marie Morski, the president of the Psychedelic Medicine Association, host of the Plant Medicine Podcast, and the founder of plantmedicine.org, as well as the medical director for wayofleaf.com. She is a Mayo Clinic trained physician in family medicine and sports medicine, as well as an attorney and former adjunct law professor. Dr. Lynn Marie Morski, welcome to Third Ways Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Paul. I'm really looking forward to our chat.
Yeah, we've been meaning to do this for about a year now. We had first met at Horizons, I believe, in 2019 through Joe Moore, who's the host of the Psychedelics Today podcast, and had briefly spoken at that point, and then had planned to do a podcast in person at the SciTech conference in Tel Aviv. And then COVID hit and we had to cancel, we had to postpone. So I'm still excited to at some point come on your podcast. I know we'll make that happen. But for the time being, I think what I'm really excited about diving in today with you is just this intersection of your background, why you started the Plant Medicine Podcast, how that led to the Psychedelic Medicine Association. And then, with your background as a lawyer, you're sort of a rare breed in the psychedelic space, and definitely an overachiever as it relates to that intersection. So I think it'll be really, really great to dive into those topics today.
Well, I'm excited to dive into all that. And like you said, to have you on the Plant Medicine Podcast for sure. Everything's our rescheduling from COVID is all going to happen. And so I'm looking forward to, I had your good friend, James Fadman on, and whenever I think of microdosing, I think of you two, like almost in the same breath. So we've got to get you on as well.
I would love that. So let's just provide a little bit of context for our listeners. What I always love to start with is, what led you to getting involved in the psychedelic space? So, you had started the Plant Medicine Podcast a couple years ago now. Where was Lynn Marie before then? What sort of led to your decision to really come out publicly in support of these powerful medicines?
Well, Lynn Marie, way before then, was raised super conservatively. I didn't drink till maybe 26. I had not touched cannabis at age 35. So I definitely had never done a psychedelic. And I distinctly recall, because I worked at the Department of Defense, I was a VA employee. I was a doctor for, veterans at this point. And you cannot, you can't be doing CBD. Like they said they can drug test you at any time. And so I was not going to get near anything that would jeopardize my job. And comically, sometime in my 35th year of life, somebody said, have they drug tested you yet? You've been there like 4 years. And I was like, no. And he's like, try this. And it was like, cannabis vape or something like that. And I was like, all right, well, sure. And then comically, I think I went to Burning Man like the next month, and somebody there, and of course I know nothing about what I'm doing. And somebody gives me some LSD, and I don't have any idea the amount or what was going on. Luckily, it was not a high dose. But that night, I had like the most therapeutic realization, and I had no basis for realizing that these were even a thing, because I had never done psychedelics and I had heard nothing about psychedelic science. MAPS at this point is like 30 years old, and our normal medical school training does not mention psychedelic medicine at all. And so I was like, wow, that was really cool to have that, realization. And then I had done a few other psychedelics over the next year or so, and both times, or every time, I was like, oh, learning something new about myself. And then it's 2017, finally, because that happened in 2013. 2017, I hear the Tim Ferriss podcast episode about, I think, MAPS, something related to MAPS. And I was like, oh, this is a field. This is not just like isolated, I'm having these therapeutic realizations. This happens to many people that do it. And there's a field of, and so right then I became very interested in it, and I wanted to get more involved. And then I did ayahuasca in 2018. Now, remember, I'm still a Department of Defense employee, so I still have to keep this completely on the down low. And I have a book out and I have a podcast out on this other topic, and people would interview me on their shows or for articles, and they'd be like, is there anything we can't ask you about? And I was like, yeah, unfortunately, you cannot ask me about the most transformative things I do, like ayahuasca or, these other medicines. And that was so out of alignment for me. I'm going to work, seeing veterans who could all benefit from these things. And I can't tell them they could be doing them. I can't tell them I've done them. I can't tell the world that I've done them. It was not me. I like to be the full me and out there and, be able to share all aspects of my life. And so finally in 2019, in May, without any backup job whatsoever, I quit the VA. And I did not know what was going to come next, but I made it my mission to spread the word about plant medicines and psychedelics to other practitioners, other clinicians, because, you can spread it to each person one by one individually. But if I could convince one doctor about their efficacy, then that person can touch 100 people a week. And I know that we don't know about these. I would talk to, I'd go to these when I would speak at conferences for that other topic I spoke about, and I would talk to my colleagues there, and none of them knew this was a thing. Maybe if they were into psychiatry, they'd heard of ketamine. But even most family med docs didn't know ketamine was available. And so I was like, this is my calling. This is where I need to take the reins and try to educate clinicians. And that's how I started the Plant Medicine podcast and plantmedicine.org. And then I started the Psychedelic Medicine Association when I realized doctors don't learn from podcasts necessarily. So I wanted to find some way to more efficiently get them. Exactly. I was like, how do I get into their inboxes? That's where they get their info. And so that's how the Psychedelic Medicine Association came to be.
So when you started the Plant Medicine podcast, what was your thought process just around being a medical doctor, having those credentials, there's a board that you're probably certified through. What went through your mind? Did you do any due diligence as part of that? Or were you just like, screw it, this means too much to me, I'm just going to come out and start interviewing folks about this?
It's funny you ask, because I think it was just 2 or 3 days ago, I had to laugh to myself because I tend to struggle a little bit with anxiety. And yet for some reason, I'm really worried every time I walk outside that my car has been stolen or other things that are so unlikely. But I did not for a second worry about that thing you just talked about. It's going out. Not only do I have a medical license, but at this point I'm in the California Bar Association, right? I've been barred by California. So I'm a California barred lawyer. And, the California Medical Board exists, and I was licensed there. For some reason, that didn't stop me. I don't know why. I would look to people like, Julie Holland, Dr. Julie Holland, who is also a physician and very out there about psychedelics, and other people in the industry who were out, talking about these things with, medical letters behind their names, and they were doing it and seemed to be okay so far. And I was like, well, I think I just have to be, fairly smart about it. Most of these things that I've done can be done in other countries, so who's to say if I did ayahuasca, if I come out and say I did ayahuasca, who's to say where I did it, and that kind of thing. So that's how I convinced myself that it was going to be okay. But as these things became more luckily, more and more research comes out showing their efficacy, and people are, the Thank You Plant Medicine movement comes out and more people are talking about it, and then all these decrim movements. And so that all keeps me feeling safe about this decision. But I also thought maybe the fact that I'm a doctor and a lawyer gives me an extra little piece of confidence that your average doctor might not have. I know the legal system a little bit better. So somewhere in there, I got the confidence to just talk about it. It wasn't so much I'm just going to tell you that what I've done, psychedelic wise, but I thought if I'm just bringing information, especially just the podcast, I'm just bringing information. How can they, cite me for just bringing out scientific information? And so that was my hope at that point.
How many interviews have you done at this point for the Plant Medicine podcast?
We just released episode 82.
So you've been doing this basically weekly.
Yes. Until this year, it was weekly. Yeah.
Okay.
I have a number of jobs. And so it got to be a lot. And also, the first 60 something episodes was an encyclopedia of medicine. So I knew exactly what I was going to do. So we've got the 4 on MDMA, for example. You've got a patient episode, a patient experience, a scientific research episode, a practitioner episode, and a history/legality. So it was just kind of easy to find that. Now that those are done, it's more okay, what esoteric topic are we going to discuss today? It's a little bit, harder to find things, because what I want to cover now that we've covered all the medicines is I want to cover all the conditions and what psychedelics are good for them. So let's do MDMA for PTSD or ketamine for suicidality, but as I had to slow down a little bit. We're going to run out of those really quickly. So, because the podcast was churning faster than research was coming out. So it's every other week. But yeah, we've had some great names. Julie Holland, like I mentioned, she just recorded with me, and she recorded an hour and a half straight and let me cut it into 3. And so these are 3 of my favorites because she's just an idol of mine and somebody I really admire. And so, and I've had, like I said, James Fabin has been on twice, and a lot of repeat people, because once I have them on and I love them,
You're like,
I love having
come back on. I want to have you
Yes.
have you again.
Yeah.
Have you again.
So probably like 75 people, but 83 episodes.
So when it comes to then, medicine, you had mentioned you had gone through medical school and this was early 2000s when you were in medical school?
Yeah, I graduated in 2005.
So what was taught about cannabis or psychedelics, or sort of, was there anything that you learned in medical school that would have been applicable to what's happening now?
I recall exactly 0 mentions of either of those things. I don't think they taught the endocannabinoid system. I don't remember cannabis being mentioned. Definitely not psychedelics. If they were mentioned, perhaps it was in some kind of pharmacology class or something, but I have no recollection of those. And like I said, even when you go through, and for example, we used ketamine as an anesthetic in the emergency room for kids. And so I didn't think it was a horse tranquilizer. I thought it was a kid anesthetic. And then the first time I worked at Envision Festival in the medical tent, and people are doing ketamine, I was thoroughly confused. And, I had because I was a combination of somebody in medical school who heard nothing about psychedelics with a person who didn't use any drugs. So I was just very, very blindsided by a lot of things. So yeah, they taught us nearly nothing. And I'm very interested to talk with the medical students of today, because many of them have joined the Psychedelic Medicine Association to ask, like, are you even educated on the endocannabinoid system? Something as basic as that. Like, we know about this. Are they starting to tell you about that? And I hope that they are. But that's where a big gap is. That's what the Psychedelic Medicine Association is trying to fill, is that gap where medical schools will not have this as part of their curriculum for a long time. And CME is catching up. There are a few CME courses on it, which is continuing medical education, which every doctor, has to do, but they get to pick and choose which ones they do of that. So it's still like not guaranteedly going to be getting to all the people who need to know about it. So that's our goal, is to try to get to, and not to psychiatrists or the mental health professionals, because they're actually more likely to learn about it through their own specialties. But 80% of antidepressant prescriptions are written by primary care docs. And so that's who we want to get to, because we want patients who have depression, PTSD, anxiety, et cetera, to know that there's a full range of options, and antidepressants and therapy are just 2 of them. So I want them to have hope that there's more, and ones that frankly work better.
Yeah, this is a huge gap right now. I mean, I was even talking with a supporter of ours at Third Wave, and he had mentioned, he sees a therapist in Toronto. He's based in Canada, and how the therapist knows about psychedelics, but for whatever reason doesn't, isn't going that path, or hasn't gone that route, and he had an interesting sort of reason for that, which I don't know if I fully agree with necessarily, but he essentially said, a lot of the therapists who have full practices, or maybe this could be primary care physicians, whoever it is, it's a big risk for them to all of a sudden start talking about psychedelics, because there is so much stigma that still exists. So he's like, I've noticed that a lot of the therapists who maybe don't have full caseloads are getting into this because it's sort of the new hot emerging thing, right? And so what he kept speaking to was, there needs to be, we need to fill that gap in terms of professional education for clinicians and therapists and doctors and psychiatrists, because ultimately educating that sort of like that class of folks is exactly going to do what you said. It's going to have these downstream effects where then their clients and the people that they work with actually recognize sort of the potential of these substances.
Yeah, absolutely. And I get the fear. And I remember speaking early on with Sean McAllister, who was the attorney for Decrim Denver. And I said, I had a meeting with he and his partner, and I asked, like, can doctors talk about, because we didn't cover, even in law school, we didn't cover talking about, I didn't take a specific health law class that would have covered this, but we didn't talk about, can you legally talk about illegal things? But you have to think about it for a second. Of course you can, because think about if a doctor finds out somebody is on heroin or something and that person comes in, of course they're going to have a conversation about heroin with that patient. Here's the dangers of you continuing to do heroin, etc. Right? And so like forever people have been having conversations about illegal things. Just that this is like a newer thing that may not be legal for long. We start to think of it differently, but no, you can have those conversations. I think we get into a bigger legal gray area when it's something like actual referrals. I was even discussing this with Dr. Holland on the show, is like, she can't say, go to this specific, here, let me write you, because, doctors, you can write referrals to, please go see a gastroenterologist. Because most doctors, and I'm just rambling, there's so many things to cover at this, but most doctors are not going to be doing the psychedelic therapy. They are going to be referring to someone else, right? Like if I was a family medicine doc, I'm not going to start doing ketamine infusions in my office, right? I'm not going to start having 1-hour appointments where I'm guiding people through a DMT journey or 8 hours where I'm doing MDMA therapy, right? That's not part of their purview. It's just going to be knowing when to refer to somebody who does do it. But that's all, that's where the legality comes in. Can I suggest a patient go seek out this illegal therapy? And then what about if it's illegal here, but not there? Like, what if you say, okay, maybe look at synthesis, or, you recommend a therapy that is legal in the place where it is, and I have to say, there's not a lot of great answers to that, but I understand the trepidation. But just know that speaking about psychedelics, and, if you're a therapist and you pull up your little Google on the computer while the patient is there and put in psilocybin plus depression, and you read off what it says, is that illegal? No, that patient could have done that themselves at home, right? You were just saying, this is what research has found. That is not illegal to do. And I think at least if the doctors, therapists, etc., can get that far to where they say, hey, patient, there's hope. Because if a patient doesn't know about psychedelics and they're thinking, my gosh, antidepressants didn't work, therapy hasn't worked, I'm at the end of my rope. Well, first off, there's ketamine. There's always that's something everybody should know about now because it's legal and available. But say they've done ketamine and they want to further address trauma, just to know ayahuasca exists, to know psilocybin exists, these other things. Then if they want to seek out further on their own, great. But I think just it's crucial that the providers arm them with that knowledge. And that's how it's going to be safer too, because, if they are on antidepressants, there's certain psychedelics they shouldn't be doing. So they should at least be able to have that conversation, and just think about it like somebody came into you and they were on heroin or crack or whatever else, and you wanted to help them still manage their health. You still have to talk about interactions of their medicines with the things that they're doing on the outside. You can't be like, oh, can't talk about those interactions because heroin's illegal. No, you have to do what's best for the patient. I think that's that same paradigm we have to realize as far as psychedelics go.
Well, and a lot of this comes back to education. This is why we even started Third Wave in the first place, was back 5-6 years ago. I noticed that whenever someone typed, ayahuasca or MDMA or psilocybin into Google, the first things that popped up were like the National Institute of Drug Abuse saying all the terrible reasons why you should never do any of these things because they're illegal and they're very harmful. And so I made it our goal and our mission to, okay, how do we at least get to the top of that? So that way when folks are searching for their own information, they can actually find reputable, science-backed research and information, because then it's just sort of this continuous sort of corrupt cycle where people stay stuck in this mindset of, oh no, psilocybin is bad because it's illegal, and it's illegal because it's bad. Well, actually, there's this whole different perspective that most folks aren't even considering, and I feel like that even then goes into to doctors, like you said, if they can't now say, okay, go work with an underground practitioner with psilocybin, which they can't do. They can't have referrals for, at least in the United States. At the very least, they can say, hey, I've heard psilocybin is efficacious in clinical trials. You might want to check out this resource, whether it's Third Wave or Psychedelics Today or another sort of educational platform. So that way patients can start to make better and better decisions for themselves. Because this isn't just, like you said, this isn't just like a one-way road, right? It's not like we're only trying to educate the medical professionals. It is sort of a virtuous cycle where the medical professionals learn about it, but ideally also the mass population knows about it, because only then can people make informed decisions about what is really best for them, rather than just a doctor prescribing a pill, so to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes both ways, because for sure we want, all patients to know about these. And there are plenty of patients that are, especially in probably the circles we run in, that are like, doctors are so behind the times in education, and we don't need them to tell us what to do. Fair, very fair in lots of areas. But there are also, we've got to think about the people who are, like my parents' age, living in Southern Illinois, that don't have a psychedelic community, and they are looking to their doctors for what is okay and what is not, especially that generation. My parents are in their young 70s, early 70s, and they grew up with the in the 60s, where these were things used to tune in and drop out and all that. And so now they have whatever kind of stigma against it. And I'm sure they would be much more comfortable taking it if a doctor said to them, besides their daughter, this is a legitimate treatment at this point. So for both reasons, to kind of stabilize and destigmatize things for those who really do trust doctors, and just to get the information to those who, whether or not they trust their medical professionals, who are able to make their own decisions. Either way, I just think it's crucial, because once we get these things FDA approved, say like psilocybin and MDMA, in addition to ketamine, what good does it do if no doctor prescribes them or no doctor refers to them? They're going to get to so few people. And I think the goal that we all have is getting these to everybody who can benefit from them.
So let's go back into a little bit of the origin story, and I think that'll help us continue to make waves through your path and why you chose what you chose to do. So you started the Plant Medicine podcast in May 2019. You were working for the VA before that. You quit your job as a doctor for the VA, decided to fully commit in many ways to psychedelics, even though, you just started the podcast at that time and you probably weren't sure how it would turn out.
Right. That's definitely not paying any of my bills. That is
yeah. As we know, a podcast is nice to have, but it's not like we're the Tim Ferrisses and Joe Rogans of the world getting $100 million Spotify deals by any stretch of the imagination. So you start the Plant Medicine podcast, you're publishing weekly podcasts, and then end of 2019, beginning of 2020, there's more and more investor attention, right? There's more and more money coming into the space. How did you then make the leap to going from, okay, I'm just going to host a podcast, to starting really the preeminent association for psychedelic medicine in the space today?
Well, I appreciate that. I don't know that there's a second one, but I'm very glad that we're preeminent.
Well, it's always good to be the only,
Right.
Yeah.
Well, so, I have to give credit where credit is due, because I had gone down to Colombia in late January, and I had done Jahe down there. Very difficult. I always said I'm not going to do jungle ayahuasca, and well, I did it. But afterward, my friends and I were still down in Medellin, and they're both big in business. And I was like, guys, I need to get information to doctors, and it's not like working the podcast. And one of my friends, Valerie, she said, you need to form an association. And I think she had a different idea for what it was than I did, but somehow I just was like, okay, noted. And then COVID struck. I had moved to Austin. I was stuck in an apartment by myself, like in a new city. And I remember going to GoDaddy, and I was like, I'm just going to buy this URL, Psychedelic Medicine Association. And maybe we can see where it started from there. Then I get a message on LinkedIn from Henri, who we both know, of the Conscious Fund. And he was asking me to help to make some continuing medical education for psychedelics. And I said, yeah, I'm, totally happy to do that. I said, I'm trying to start this Psychedelic Medicine Association. So maybe we could promote the CME course through that. And he's like, hold on, what? And apparently he and his people had tried to buy that URL like 2 weeks prior, and it was gone because I had bought it. So I was like, what are the chances of those people being brought together? So at that point, they helped us, like, okay, they gave me Barney, who is our tech CTO, and they said, all right, you two make this happen. Because, otherwise I would have been using Fiverr, and this would have taken 2 years. But now suddenly I had like a tech guru to make the website and everything. And then they gave us some connections to a lot of the big players in the industry. And it was just like a lot of things happened very quickly, and we're very grateful. And so now we have over 200 members, individual members, and we have over 50 organizations. And we're putting out a newsletter every month that keeps everybody up to date in psychedelic science. And starting at the end of April, we're going to put on we're doing monthly panels that are for members only. And for example, our first panel I'm very excited about is increasing access to ketamine, because it's so unaffordable for so many at this point. And there are a lot of providers out there using different kind of creative techniques to be able to get people who need ketamine into those therapies. And so that's the kind of thing we're doing at the association. And so that's essentially, it's been a year since somebody, a year and 2 months since somebody mentioned the word association, and definitely under a year since I bought that URL. And so just it's the ultimate test, or a testimony to synchronicity, that myself and the Conscious One people were all brought together and made this happen. And I'm very grateful.
And so what's the legal structure of that? Is it a nonprofit? Is it a, like,
Public
how are
benefit
you?
corp.
And so what's your sort of 5 to 10 year plan in terms of what you envision the Psychedelic Medicine Association becoming?
So what I want to clarify, because the fact that, and this is why I said, is maybe Valerie had a different idea of association, because in the US, when you have a medical association, for example, the American Psychiatric Association, that is an association of psychiatrists in America. Like, the name is very clear. Our name sounds like we are an association of people who do psychedelic medicine. No, we are actually an association of people who need to learn about psychedelic medicine, but that is a very long title. And also, we're not just American, we are worldwide. So we've got a ton of people from the UK and Canada and Australia. So my giant goal is, whatever it looks like, I'm not the world's best strategist. Like, I want this number of organizations and this number of members. What I want is that when psychedelics come up in a conversation and somebody doesn't know about it, at least somebody in that circle can say, hey, head on over to Psychedelic Medicine Association, join up. They'll get you started from the ground floor up, and they can look through, once you join, you get the backlog of all the months you missed. You get the primer on psychedelic medicines, which comes with just the basics. You get your indications, what it's good for, what it's been studied for, and contraindications. For example, if you've got a patient going to do an ayahuasca ceremony, make sure they are not on these certain psych meds, those kinds of things, just enough information for them to at least get a conversation started. And I just want us to have subgroups where there's maybe a subgroup of people that love talking about ketamine assisted therapy, or a subgroup that talks about psychedelic research, a subgroup that works on new ways to do DMT therapy. Like, I would love to have little groups in little cities. I just want there to be this overall push worldwide to get, to close that gap, to bridge that gap, especially between, doctors my age and older that definitely didn't hear anything about it in our school and our training, all the way to ones now that hopefully are hearing something about it. But I don't want it to be to where you go to one doctor, they know everything about it, and you go to another doctor and those patients are not getting any information. Like, hopefully, as it spreads more and more, that's my goal, is that patients don't walk in to an appointment and their doctor stares at them like a deer in the headlights if they mention psychedelics. And they don't walk in and saying, I'm having all these, mental health issues, and psychedelics aren't mentioned. Like, my ultimate goal is that psychedelics are mentioned and everybody feels comfortable enough to have that conversation.
Which is a big goal. And thankfully, you aren't alone in that, because of all the research that MAPS is doing. I mean, my mom, for example, who's in her mid-60s, works as a social worker at a hospital, like a small hospital in West Michigan. And she got an email a few weeks ago from this organization called SANA, I think, SANA.
SANA Symposium.
Yeah, about a SANA Symposium, because they were doing a webinar on MDMA for PTSD. And so I, of course, have been talking to my mom about psychedelics for like 7 years now, since 2014. So she's well aware. Initially, she was very skeptical, but now with all the research coming out, she also understands. But she just forwarded that to me as sort of a sign that even, she works in a small hospital in West Michigan, and now they're even getting information about MDMA for PTSD. She's had webinars about ketamine already, where doctors are coming in to teach about ketamine. So it feels like having an organization like the Psychedelic Medicine Association just lends additional legitimacy and credibility, and ideally acts as sort of a center of gravity for the medical community to actually have, like you said, all of these fantastic assets and resources and webinars that you're putting together for them.
Thank you. I think somebody from the medical director from Field Trip had brought that up. I think he's a family medicine doctor, and he said it feels like just coming, because we have a forum on the once you're a member, you come onto the member forum and you can talk with other members and ask questions, et cetera. And he said, I can just imagine what a safety in numbers feeling that will be, to have other doctors come in and be like, oh, we're all talking about this. I'm not going way out on a limb mentioning this to my patients. And like you said, center of gravity wise, I like that that visual, because that is what I want. Because if they come in and they not only see, okay, we've got hundreds of other clinicians that are having these conversations, but they see the 50 plus organizations that are all working on this. And we got ones that are doing research. We've got ones that are doing legislation. We've got ones that are helping increase access, that it feels like, okay, I'm not so alone in this. And like you said, resource wise, if they're like, I'm thinking of maybe doing ketamine therapy, we're like, here's people who do ketamine education. Here's ones that are doing great ketamine assisted therapy like we can provide them those resources to feel even more supported.
So one thing that you had touched on a few minutes ago was accessibility. And I think that's a really important point to come back to, because this is a huge topic of conversation in the psychedelic space right now. There was just the recent discussion between Tim Ferriss and Christian Angermeyer about patents and IP and how that might limit accessibility. A lot of folks have not been super gung-ho about Compass Pathways because they sense that what Compass Pathways is doing will limit accessibility. Compass Pathway says what they're doing will help accessibility because it ensures that insurance coverage will then come to help with psychedelic medicine. What's sort of the current state of accessibility for ketamine therapy in particular in the States? Is it covered by insurance? How expensive is it for folks to get access to? Can you just give us sort of an overview of that, where it stands now, at least?
Sure. As best I know, there is no insurance covering plain old ketamine, like the kind you get IV, IM, except for I was in contact because I continue to tell everybody, like, if you know of somebody doing ketamine in a way that's out of the box and not thousands of dollars, please tell me. And so somebody turned me on to a group called Clarasana, and I spoke with them. And in Colorado and Texas, they are doing Medicare, like I think it's Medicare or Medicaid, forgive me, it's one of the medic somethings, is covering it. But essentially what they're billing for is not the ketamine itself, because that's an off-label use and you can't bill for that in that way, but they're billing for the services. We're billing for our therapy. We're billing for a doctor's visit, that kind of thing. And then there's also Spravato, which is the one FDA-approved Johnson & Johnson S-ketamine nasal spray. And so if you have insurance, because it's extremely expensive on its own, but insurance will cover it to where maybe your copay is $5 or $10 so that you're not paying that hundreds. Society is somewhere, but not, the patients are able to at least get it that way. But in between those, we have so many ketamine clinics that are charging thousands of dollars per infusion. And I would just love to have like a sit down with all of them and just say, like, why? Because ketamine, the actual fluid itself, generic, is like dollars per bottle. And so I don't understand, unless there's a therapist of PhD level or, social worker level, whatever, or higher, sitting in the room for that entire time. Even then, like, what is that? $300, $400? Like, I don't know why it's costing so much, especially the clinics that don't have somebody beyond like a medical assistant sitting there with the person. I am not business is not my specialty, and I am not judging at this point, but I want to know what the cause is, because I want to be able to offer some alternatives. So like I said, our first option, our first panel we're having is going to have people on who are doing different methods. Maybe I think Dr. Pamela Crisco, she's in the Canadian Psychedelic Association. She does group sessions with first responders. And those are subsidized in a certain way. So they're definitely not paying these thousands of dollars. And so like group sessions is an option, and sliding scale is an option. But yeah, right now it's a little bit frustrating that the one that's available is only like available in quotes, because it's not that accessible to a lot of people. And so luckily there
that's
are
Spravato.
Spravato
is the one.
Spravato is the one that is FDA approved. So if you have like the certain insurance that covers it, and certain insurances, right? I don't think all of them cover it. I think there's still issues with whether the VA covers it or not. I have not heard the latest, but I know it was maybe one day they did, one day they didn't. And, VA's got a massive population of people who need these kinds of treatments. But I'm talking about like just the regular ketamine. It may be thousands of dollars for you to be getting ketamine infusions if that's what you need. And so that's where I'm hoping that we can get together and talk about, there's two sides of this. I want to increase accessibility to it, but I also want to increase the quality of what happens when people go for it. That there's you just go in, they put a needle in your arm, you sit there with somebody who has no discussion with you. Maybe you chit chat with somebody before you walk out. And then there's ketamine assisted psychotherapy, where there's somebody there with you the whole time, like in the MDMA trials that we hear about. And I'm not the arbiter of what is good or bad, but there are a lot of ketamine guidelines coming out of places. And it's part of my, drive in what I do in the Psychedelic Medicine Association is that as the ones that are legal are here, I want them to be both accessible and done well. Because if people look at ketamine clinics like, oh, these are popping up because they're cash cows and people aren't really getting better because there's no therapy, like that's not helping the movement as a whole, and that's not helping patients individually. So accessibility and quality of care are big points for me.
Well, and two things come up on that point. One, Lucid News just published a piece a couple weeks ago about kind of ketamine providers arguing over what's ethical and what are the appropriate standards. You had on one hand, like you said, the ketamine assisted psychotherapy saying there needs to be prep, there needs to be the experience, there needs to be integration. And then on the other hand, you had someone representing more ketamine infusions and just saying, like we have this methodology, we've been doing it, it's worked for thousands and thousands of people. I've heard horror stories of folks who go in to get a ketamine infusion with no prep or support and come out and, their ego has been shattered and they're actually re-traumatized to some degree rather than being helped. And at the same time, I'm sure there are lots of folks who find that temporary relief, even if it's just a ketamine infusion, but there isn't the sort of integration that's so often talked about as necessary in the psychedelic space. Now, one thing that's popped up as of late has been telemedicine ketamine therapy, which we haven't hit on yet. What's your take on that? I personally, we've done a little bit of a partnership with Mindbloom. I've gone through the Mindbloom experience, but I don't, I'm fairly healthy. I've just had some anxiety through COVID and it's been helpful. I had to have a peer treatment monitor, like a friend who was there in the room with me when I was doing the ketamine. And then I had a virtual guide before and after who helped me prepare and integrate. And yet I also just watched this, I don't know if you saw this video of Jamie Wheel with Rebel Wisdom that he did maybe a week or two ago, basically bashing Mindbloom and saying, now we're just, sending ketamine to anyone and everyone, and there's very little support and you just get the virtual help. What is there a middle ground? What's the middle ground? Like when it comes to accessibility, what do you feel like is a good balancing point maybe now and maybe where it's going as well?
Yeah, I think you brought up a great point, which is, can we get it to a lot of people, but it's quasi-effective, or can we get it to nobody, but it's super effective? And what's the middle ground? And I'm thinking, like, I believe Dr. Mark Bronstein, who I've had on my podcast more than once, I know he does, especially when COVID hit, had to do, the telemedicine version. But the impression I was getting is like, these are already long-standing patients. And he's a psychiatrist. And he happens to say, okay, now that I know you, let's, and I think you could benefit from ketamine therapy. Let's do it. By the way, if Mark hears this, I hope I'm not grossly misquoting what you do, but it seems like, okay, if it's part of your therapist plan, I think and I don't know Mindbloom's, but if it's a situation where it's like, you didn't know me yesterday, you're going to watch me do this for one session. Like, I don't know how it's set up, but I think the longitudinality of care is important. And I think the psychotherapeutic before and after, so that the first time you're conversing isn't the same day. Because if the same day, you probably have so many jitters and things going through your head that I know if it were me, I'd be like, just get to the ketamine, like I'm so excited for the actual treatment. So I probably wouldn't be like as present for the therapy session. But if they're like, you have an entire day ahead of time set aside for your intentions and your therapy, and then we'll do the therapy, and then we have an entire day afterward, then I think I'd feel more comfortable with the model. But I also feel most comfortable if it's somebody that you have a long-standing relationship with, because that's just 3 points in time. Think about like something maybe after after that closing session happens to you and it drags up some trauma that came back and blah, blah, blah. Like, where's your longitudinal person to follow up with on that? I think everybody, I say this as I don't currently have one, but I think everybody should have like a long-term therapist, right? I'm still just in the process of finding a somatic therapist that I jive with, but to have somebody just like your personal trainer, just like your trainer for the mind, somebody that's always there helping you as needed. Maybe you don't need to go all the time, but if you need somebody, you've got a relationship with somebody, you can pop back in and say, hey, that thing that's been flaring up 3 months ago is kind of back. That makes you feel more comfortable than the kind of one-off telemedicine things. But again, we're back at the point where is whatever that saying is like, is perfection the enemy of good? Like is this a good way, but not perfect? And then because it's not perfect, do we cut out that accessibility? So I'd say like the things that I think would be helpful is this longitudinality of care and a big psychotherapeutic element to it.
There was the short story, We Will Call It Paula, which I'm sure you've read and are familiar with. And that was a core point in that long form piece, was essentially, what if, I think there's a quote in there, something about, we'll just milk you like a cow and then kick you out in the street, which speaks to the importance of community, speaks to the importance of feeling held before, during, and after, speaks to the importance of longitudinal care. And it feels like, just with where we're at right now in April 2021, like, Mindbloom has this model where I think it's $1,200 for 4 experiences. And, their whole thing is, normally if you went in to do ketamine infusions, it would be 4 times that amount or 3 times that amount. So it's not even accessible. And yet I've even realized that, having done the ketamine therapy at home and also having obviously a wide range of experiences with ayahuasca and psilocybin and more potent plant medicines, that the ketamine is nice, but it has this sort of temporary like stress relief, like it sort of like depressurizes things, but it doesn't have necessarily the like full-blown profound insight, like deep healing potential if it's just done at home, sort of by yourself. And I don't know what to make of it, because on the one hand, it's like, it's great to provide people with relief, especially in COVID, and help them to see that there's hope and an opportunity on the other side. At the same time, like, you don't want this to become the next sort of SSRI or pharmaceutical where people are like, okay, if I want to get back to that state, I just need to keep purchasing more generic ketamine and keep doing ketamine again and again and again. There's really very little middle ground at this point in time. Like, I'm hopeful for a future where like these sort of new churches pop up where you can go into like a synthesis and you can do it in a group ceremony, and you can have the support of not only an individual therapist, but also a community of people who support you, who see you through that. And as we both know, we're in COVID right now, and getting together in groups is just a little tricky. So that's where it feels like it's a tricky issue. There's no simple answers for this. Getting medicine in the hands of folks who need it is important, but just as critical as set and setting, just as critical as the support that you have as you're going through these experiences.
Yeah, I think you brought up a lot of good points there. And one thing I want to harken back to is just, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, we released an episode called The Dark Side of Ketamine. And it's a huge thing to, like you just said, is if it gives you that little stress release, well, so does alcohol, so does, other recreational drugs. What's to stop it from starting to be used that way? And it has been. And we're seeing misuse, and we're seeing suicides, and we're seeing deaths from other complications. And it's the one psychedelic that is actually addictive. The irony is that all the ones that are not addictive are the Schedule I ones. And here we have ketamine. It's legal, but also kind of addictive. So that is and Dr. Bronstein had talked about, there's like the psycholytic, and there's 2 forms essentially. Like, one is what you did with Mindbloom, which is where like you didn't really blast off, right? You're just a little bit of changing of the neurochemistry. And then there's like, I've never done that version. I've only done IM and IV, where you have like ego dissolution and you've dissociated and all that. I have no desire to go back and do that a million times. And also I think it's much more profound, right? So we have that essentially those seem to be getting at the core issues. And these home versions are kind of just like you said with SSRIs, like these smaller band-aids that they can help. I think they can help if for some reason you're having a hard time letting go with a therapist, it can foster that kind of ease of connection, and it may rewire things in another way. But you're right, it doesn't have that same effect of necessarily like digging out that old school trauma. I have not had it, but I am, as far as I'm understanding from the ketamine practitioners, that those are like 2 very distinct and different levels of ketamine therapy. And you're right, that's something we really, and I think a lot of people are watching out for now, is like, what are the implications from this kind of like longer term, smaller amount of ketamine therapy? And so I appreciate you bringing that up, because that's absolutely something we need to watch out for.
I think it's like psycholytic therapy, which is it's usually a smaller amount as like an opening so that the therapist can work with it. And then I think the other one is just, I think it's psychedelic assisted psychotherapy would be the technical term.
Yeah, I was trying to think of the name of the, like, did they just call it psychedelic therapy and psycholytic therapy? Perhaps.
I think it was that, because Stan Groff had written about this even back in the 60s, the difference between those two, because he used to load people up with, 1,000 micrograms of LSD, and he would call that psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, because they would go into the birth matrix, or, whatever the sort of coex that he had came up with. And that was much different than psycholytic, because the ego is still present in psycholytic therapy, but you're just learning how to sort of help it heal and come back to a place of sort of balance, rather than trying to dissolve it completely.
Yeah, that makes sense. So whatever it's called, there's definitely those two, and I think a lot of us in psychedelics see that a lot of the more curative type things, where you don't have to continue to put band-aids over it, are happening at those higher levels, those higher doses, that, like you said, when the ego is gone, or whatever kind of things happen. And so it's going to be interesting to see what those smaller doses over time, I mean, this is all new-ish. So very, very interesting to watch how this develops.
So we talked a lot about your medical background, which is part and parcel and central to the Plant Medicine Podcast and the Psychedelic Medicine Association. We haven't yet really discussed much about your legal background, and I'd love if you could just bring listeners into that a little bit. What inspired you to get a law degree, and then how has that law degree helped you as you've started, the Plant Medicine Podcast and the Psychedelic Medicine Association? What role does it play in your professional life at this point in time?
I should have always been a lawyer instead of a doctor. It's very clear. Like, if you look at my grades from the two different schools, vastly different. But life takes us on its certain path. But I'd gotten my medical degree, and I'd gone to residency and family medicine, and then I'd done fellowship in sports medicine. And then I realized I didn't want to do any of those things. And so I got the job I had at the VA, moved out to San Diego, and the apartment I moved into was next to a law school they were building. And I've always been really good at checking in with the intuition. And my intuition was like, go there, go there, go there. And I'm in a brand new city, and I thought, I'll have like a community. I'll be with students. And I read a book called How to Take the LSAT when I was in 8th grade, for like the, you need to read a book over the summer kind of program they had. And so I had tutored multiple people on how to take the LSAT, and I had never taken it myself. And I was like, I could take the LSAT. Like, I super nerded out at the possibility of going to law school. And I just said, okay, I have $250,000 in medical school debt, but if I can get in and they'll give me a scholarship, I'll go. And that was in like August, and I started in January. Like, everything just lined itself up, and somehow they had a mid-year start. And so I started law school, and I just thought, like, it gives you tools for how to think. It improves your writing. I will know how to review my own contracts, just basic things in life. But since I never loved the traditional practice of medicine, I thought, okay, there's got to be some way that if I get this law degree, I can combine the two into, like, the combination together will be powerful, and I won't necessarily have to just practice medicine or just practice law. I'll find some way to make these into a new career. And I'm not going to lie, it took a very long time for that to become a reality, but finally it has, because now my job that does pay the bills is I'm the medical director of wayofleaf.com, which was a cannabis website, and now is a cannabis and psychedelics website, thankfully. And the way I got the medical director job is I was just an editor for them. And then I finally said, like, legally you shouldn't say this, and legally you shouldn't. They're like, what do you mean? I'm like, oh, well, I've got this law degree. And so then, once I was able to be useful on both fronts, that's how I got the job I have now. And, when I started Plant Medicine Association, when I started the Plant Medicine Podcast, like I said, every medicine has an episode on legality. And so I remember, I had like Ismail on from MAPS talking about ayahuasca legality, and he's talking about like RFRA. And like, I was like, okay, luckily I know what that is, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, so it helped me speak with all the lawyers that I had on the podcast. And it also just helped me write my own disclaimers, knowing how to balance that line. Because, as a doctor, let me tell you, the questions I get on Instagram and that people send through the website, they want to know medical advice. And I know I've got my own disclaimer on the beginning of the podcast. I disclaim everything I put out, and all the websites have disclaimers that I've written. So I think it's just helped me, like I said in the beginning, feel more secure balancing the life of a person with degrees and certifications that they have to protect, and living entirely in an illegal substance world, basically.
It's tricky to balance that.
Yeah.
And it's even trickier because legally, like we'd already touched on this in the podcast, truffles are legal in the Netherlands. Mushrooms are legal in Jamaica. Health Canada now with Therasil, right? Physicians and therapists can start to prescribe psilocybin for end-of-life anxiety. We're looking at FDA approval for psilocybin and MDA in 2023, 2024, ideally. Ayahuasca has been legal from a religious perspective in, I think, New Mexico and Oregon. Oakland has decriminalized all plant medicine. So there's this sort of wide swath of legal sort of challenges and issues. And one thing that I wanted to ask you about was specific to the places where it's decriminalized. How do medical professionals, is it different for medical professionals to navigate in the decrim space than it would be in a place where it's fully illegal? So in other words, if there's a physician in Oakland who knows there's local experiences going on that are protected under decrim, and I'm not saying this is the case now, but I know this is what they're pointing towards, can they refer people there? Can you talk us through some of the sort of nuance around the different legal stuff, specifically just in the United States between, legal ayahuasca, FDA, decrim, Oregon legalization? It's a mess.
I can try, but I think that a lot of, as you and I were discussing before we started recording, is that, and by the way, Sean McAllister is definitely the person to have on to talk about this more specifically. I go to him with all my questions, but if I'm just looking at this from what we know generally, is that there a lot of things that aren't written in statutes end up as case law, right? For example, that's how the different ayahuasca churches ended up being able to go ahead and practice if they have their certain exemptions, is because it ended up going, I think, to the Supreme Court. So a lot of things have to get taken to court because it's the first time somebody has brought up that question. So this may be the first time somebody has brought up the question, in a decriminalized city, can a medical practitioner refer to a ceremony that's happening? Right? That is probably not a question I imagine any statute in Oakland has covered. The Oakland Medical Society would have to have written something new in the past year, okay, doctors, you can or can't say this, right? But what we have to realize with decriminalized things, they're still legal. They're still illegal things. They just are not going to be enforced, right? Especially, and a lot of these things are definitely still illegal, even cannabis, federally. Right. So I don't know that being in a city where they have been decriminalized changes the doctors, because there's definitely still talking about an illegal substance. It changes the liability of the person who's caught doing it. That's where the decriminalization comes in, is, if you're found with, and even we have to remember, we say decrim like it's, oh, you can just carry in a pound of shrooms. Oregon, it's 12 grams or something. And it's 12 grams. If you have a 12-gram candy bar, if 11 of those grams are chocolate and 1 gram of psilocybin, that counts as your 12 grams. So, even though we say decrim, this is not a free for all in any of these cities. And so to say, I'm your doctor and I think you should just go do a bunch of mushrooms, and then they're caught with more than the amount, then they could still, there's still possibility of penalty, et cetera. So I don't know that in the decrim cities it's significantly different, but I'd still say, doctors, you can still talk to patients about this. And I always think back to, Jonathan Lubecki, who was one of the people in the MAPS trials, and he's been very vocal. He was in the military, and he said that the way he even found out about this is somebody at the VA, I believe, had written maps.org on a little shred of paper and just slid it to him secretly in an appointment. And, that has changed his entire life. And so they didn't say, hey, I think you should go do this. It was essentially maps.org. And I always think what's the equivalent of just saying, here is data on psilocybin. I hear psilocybin is decriminalized here. Maybe Google, but then I guess once they find out about it, the bigger question is, and this is what's trying to be addressed by other associations that are maybe more of the national variety, that when they pop up is okay, now how do we know who's good? Saying, go Google this for yourself. You could end up with one of those 5-MeO providers that has killed 4 people. You don't want that to happen. And definitely they've been featured on Vice, et cetera. So their names are out there, and we don't want that to be who pops up when a person goes and does this on their own. So that's the whole second thing is the doctor can say, go look this up. And then now there are people all over the psychedelic industry, hopefully working on finding ways to make sure that the good apples are the ones that they find when they do go Googling.
this is exactly what we're working on and we'll launch soon, is essentially a basically trusted resource, trusted directory of, we were initially we had thought about it like just go out with all the retreats and all the clinics and all the practitioners. And then when we thought about it a lot more, exactly what you were saying, like so much of psychedelics come down to trust. And so there has to be a specific level of vetting before you highlight or amplify, because there are even retreat centers that might look quote unquote legit on the outside, but if you do some digging, you come to realize that they've had, a number of ethical issues or sexual issues or whatever it is. And it's just like, it's a minefield out there for folks who are coming into this. And it's almost like, how do you keep people safe, as they're looking for specific practitioners to work with or specific therapists to work with. And it's even tricky on our perspective, because we've even thought from a liability perspective, if you're bringing up recommended providers, right, then as a company, we might have liability because we supposedly recommended them, right? And so it's not easy. And it goes back to even what you did with the plant medicine podcast. You have to trust that it's coming from a pure place, that it is coming from the best of intentions, that you're going to hit at about 95 to 97%. And, every now and then there might be not such a great experience. And that's why you have, specifically with practitioners, that's why there's a board, because then if any issues were to come up, then you would have to go to the board to like the client would go to the board to talk about it or whatever it might be.
Yeah, and that's Dr. Holland had said on our thing is like, I really want to talk about the need for this board, this governing board. And I know that there are people who are trying to form an association of people who do psychedelic therapy, and hopefully that becomes like a credentialing. But I think they had said to me, well, we can't form a thing that's illegal at this point. And so, you've got like the American Society of Ketamine Practitioners. And I think that's as close to a board. If it's not a board, I think it's like an organization. But you're right, without a board to report to and without guidelines, how do we even say? Because, for example, there are things that I know about going on in some of these ayahuasca retreat centers that I think are extremely appalling because they sound like really manipulative NLP. And is it criminal? No. Like the sexual abuse stuff is criminal, but I don't want to recommend a patient go to a place that says like, oh, did you get this certain outcome? If not, they're going to feel like they failed ayahuasca, right? I had that happen to somebody that I recommended to go to a place. He's like, I failed ayahuasca. I didn't get my miracle. And I was like, oh my God, like now I have to me, that's a thing that I would not want to put on, recommend somebody go to do, but is it criminal? No. So then it's like, whose standards do we use in deciding who gets to be on, like I have, and I don't pay any attention to it now, but like in the beginning, I was really big on putting like certain resources on plantmedicine.org where they could find. And I had that same realization is like, I don't want to be liable vouching for these. So I have a big disclaimer at the top. And then the second I would hear anything bad about them, I would take them off because I figured I just have to err on the side of caution at this point. Like I can't launch a full scale investigation into what happened there, but I just need to take it down in the meantime. And, kudos for you guys working to try to figure that out, because before there's a board, and it's again, how do you have a board of something that's like an indigenous healing modality? I mean, ketamine's one thing, but like how we can have a board on what's okay in an ayahuasca retreat. There's 50 different lineages, and like this, like you said, it's a total minefield, and it's an exciting but also overwhelming place to be for sometimes.
One where we started is just start small, right? So if there are like 100 retreat centers, start with 15. If there are hundreds of clinics, and what we've even decided is we're not even going to highlight the ketamine infusion clinic, because that's not technically like psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. Just highlight the clinics that are doing integrative work. With the practitioners, it's partly like a personal network thing, the folks that I know and that I trust and that I've, heard really good things about, as well as, those who have medical credentials or licensed clinical therapists. Where we've kind of gotten stuck is coaches, right? Non-clinical people, right? Because as we know, there are a lot of people who don't have clinical credentials who have been doing underground work for 20, 30, 40 years and are incredible healers, but, they don't have these clinical credentials, which means liability is there as well. So I think with anything, it's start small, like you said, be conservative, We're also rolling out a public rating and review system, so that way people can leave ratings and reviews in terms of the experience that they've had. And then it's just a matter of like being open for feedback, right? Like ensuring that we're listening, ensuring that there's reciprocity there, ensuring that we're iterating, and sort of, ultimately it's to serve the greater public, it's to serve our audience, it's to serve the community, it's to make sure there's an asset and a resource there. But it definitely is not a simple thing to do,
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why what's interesting is that, like, on the opposite end, you've got, like you said, with Compass and all that, there are lots of companies that those of us, who start off in grassroots are just like, oh no, pharma, but though they're going to bypass those issues, right? Like, they're going through a 15 million steps and paying all these billions of dollars to get something that's probably an FDA approved therapy. And then it will have a way that it can be, like, there aren't all these. So there's pros and cons to each end. And hopefully by the time that, all these things come to fruition, there's an option for everybody. If somebody doesn't want to take a website's recommendation for what retreat centers, okay, then there may be a psilocybin FDA approved thing you can go do through, USONA or something. So hopefully somewhere in there, gosh, I'm just, I'm 43, so who knows how long I'll be around for the for the super next wave of it, but I'd love a time machine into the future and see how this all plays out.
Yeah, me too. That would be nice to have, especially from a business perspective.
Right.
Could get some really good insights that way. Okay. So the Psychedelic Medicine Association, give us a little bit more about the brass tacks. How do people become members of this? What's sort of is there an annual fee that they're paying? How are you vetting people? What's just the process for enrollment, for getting more and more folks involved into the association?
Sure. And thank you for this. So we have two types of memberships. One is for the individual clinicians. And we're talking anybody from medical students or therapy students, maybe when you're getting your social work master's. Students are free. And because, yes, there is a yearly fee. The fee for a full-fledged clinician is $275 a year. And we also have a training. So if you're a resident or if you're in a training program, I think it's like $99 or something a year. And clinician-wise, nobody who can't pay will be turned away. We have made that our promise because we've all been there, right? Especially with COVID, this is a difficult time to be paying for lots of things. So please come, there's a place where you can write to us and if you need a membership and we'll get you one. But yes, it's a year fee for those individual clinicians. And you do just have to show us, I think for the student ones, you have to have like a .edu email address. And for everybody else, you just have to show us your copy of your license or something like that. Some document that shows us you're a clinician, because if you're a clinician, then when you're in the forum with everybody else, and the forum is now clinicians plus all the people from the organizations, we have a clinicians only forum because there's a lot of ways that we can talk about patients that may seem very bizarre to others, but we don't want to feel like, oh, people from the media or something are going to hear about how we talk about, like we have our own shorthand. And so we want clinicians to feel safe speaking amongst themselves. And then we also have a second type of membership, and that's the organizational membership. And that's for organizations. We've got MAPS, Therasil, Canadian Psychedelic Association, all kinds of groups that are working toward different aspects of getting psychedelic medicines to people, because our mission is to educate the clinicians. That is our sole focus. And there's only so many of us, as in it's generally me and Barney and a few other people and our lovely board. But we also want to tackle the other things that increase accessibility. So we've got legislation. We have to tackle ways to get them to diverse communities. We have to tackle, let's get more research, and how do we increase research, and all those things we want to have tackled by our helper member associations, but we want them to be able to talk to each other. Like you said, that center of gravity. And so organizations that join, they get 3 logins, and same thing, there's a yearly membership fee for them. And they don't have to be a clinician. The person who's trying to think of new research could be the person who joins, and they can go into our forum and say, hey, doctors, what is your hardest to treat condition? And that people have brought to you and said, oh, psilocybin has helped me with this. Or, just start having those. Once things are maybe FDA approved, somebody from MAPS can come in and say, hey, docs that are recommending MDMA therapy, how have your patients been doing 6 months out? To where they can follow up on how the medicines that they're producing are working. And so those are the 2 memberships, individual clinician and organization. Organizations, they don't have to show us their credential card, but they do have to abide by the North Star principles. That is how we have set it up, because we firmly believe in those and we want our members to do the same.
What are the North Star principles?
Are you going to pimp me on this? That's what we call it in medical school.
or to the best of your knowledge. So maybe provide a little context for folks, and then anything that you can remember in terms of the ethics pledge, because I don't remember offhand. But if you
I have Googled it because I'm sitting in my computer.
Good. All right, that's acceptable.
Thank you. I'm like making sure I've got the right place. So the principles here, it says, because I love these, so I'll read them anyway. But start within is number one. Is I pledge to ground my work in the field with work on myself and to treat personal growth as a lifelong process. And I think that's huge, because if, that's essentially what those of us fear, that they fear, the explosion of psychedelics, is that people who aren't even working on themselves, who are just, money hungry or whatever, that's our fear, right? That these precious medicines get into the hands of people that maybe are operating without a conscience. And so I think that's what we're hoping, is that everybody working with these is doing their own work. Number two is study their traditions, like we were talking about with the different Amazon lineages, etc. And number three is build trust, which is I pledge to invest in building trust in my relationships across the psychedelic field and repair trust where possible. I love that. Like, we don't want people to come into our forum, for example, and talk disrespectfully to each other. No, that's not going to happen. Like, you have to be a community of trust in our forum and in our association. Number four is consider the gravity. I pledge to consider the implications of the choices that I make. Like, that's what you and I were just talking about, like the gravity of what we're doing. We have to have people that are grounded in those kinds of considerations, and not just like, oh, I can make a quick buck putting up a ketamine therapy center, I'm going to do that right there. Number five is focus on process. And it says, I pledge to make the process as important as the outcome. Number six is create equality and justice. And this is one of our, highest principles. We have a diversity and inclusion person, May. She came to us from Numinous. She helps us with that. We have Kwasi Adusi, who's come on to our board to help us increase access to diverse communities. That is a big push for us. And we've always said, if anybody in a diverse community or not needs a membership, please come to us, because we want this number six, create equality and justice, to be a big focus for us, because we don't want psychedelic medicines to be another thing that the privileged are the only ones who have access to. And number seven is pay it forward. And it says, I pledge to support the flourishing of the psychedelic field in the communities in which I work, and to give back should my work lead to personal gain. And we think that pay it forward also shelters us a little bit from that fear of people who are just out for themselves, patenting the world away, and not thinking about how their work, how they can benefit others with the progress that they're making.
And what's the URL, just so that we can link to that in the show notes?
Sure. I, of course, already closed it. Hold on.
Whoops.
It is northstar.guide/ethics pledge.
northstar.guide/ethics pledge. And that was put together by the same folks who did we will call it Paula. It's sort of a collective. I know David is part of that, and Liana, and it's kind of mixed and matched. There's an art studio involved with it, but then there's the North Star crew. And they came out with this maybe a year and a half ago or so. And there are a lot of companies that have now signed up for that North Star Ethics Pledge. And it's just, again, it's a good North Star in terms of, why are we here? What are we doing? What matters? And that's really, really critical as this space grows and develops and becomes more and more mainstream.
Yeah, we had, especially because I'll be very honest, is that when we first came out, people were like, why do you have corporations as an organ, as some of your organizational members? And like I said, it's because without some corporations getting involved, your 65-year-old person in Wichita, Kansas may never see a psychedelic medicine, right? They are probably not going to go to Peru or Synthesis. They may be the one who benefits from this psychedelic pharmaceutical that is made. Or they may not go to a one-off clinic, but if they see that a ketamine clinic is, long-standing and well-established, that corporation may be their way to get the medicine they need. But on the other hand, we wanted the good players in. And, you can take a look at our list and question how well they all are actually abiding by the ethics pledge. It's the same thing with, at the point that you were talking about, is like, how do we make the cutoff? Who's doing well enough, et cetera. But we just had to put some kind of bar there. Like, these are great, like you said, a great starting point. Let's tell people that we're holding them to this. If nothing else, when you enter the Psychedelic Medicine Association, you are asked if you abide by these. You have to tell us how you abide by them. It's not like a surprise to somebody if we come back to them later and say, we're sorry, you can't be a member anymore. You've had this violation. Or what we'd rather have is, instead of calling out the whole new calling in, like, hey, we would love to see you change these so we can keep you as a member. Because that was our other thought when people said, why do you have corporations? We're like, well, they're going to do what they're going to do. Either we can invite them into our sandbox and hope that they play well with others and encourage them to play well with others, or we could just leave them out there, ostracize them, and give them no reason to behave like good actors. And so we're going with the bring them in, and whatever positive peer pressure we can with the ethics pledge and all those kinds of things, hope that has a positive effect overall.
And I think that's the best way to do it, right? We are trying to create a more inclusive world, a more sort of interconnected world. There's often a lot more that's accomplished through dialogue, even when, we disagree on things, to sort of help bring people back to the point of all of this, which is, how do we help millions and millions of people have access to these powerful medicines in containers where they feel safe and supported. And it feels like that's what you're doing with the Psychedelic Medicine Association, with the membership that you've rolled out. That's what you were doing before with the Plant Medicine podcast and the education that you were starting to roll out. So it's just so reassuring to know that someone like you, who has both a medical degree and a law degree, who has been working with these substances now, I think for 8 or 9 years, is what you had mentioned, is really sticking your neck out there to make a significant difference for the future. And it's just been, we had a chance to hang out in Austin over the summer randomly at a party. I know we got a chance to connect at Horizons. This is the first really long form conversation we've had, but it's just been a real pleasure to sit down with you, Lynn Marie, and just hear a little bit more about everything that you're up to, everything that Psychedelic Medicine Association is up to. And I think, just as a last note to leave our listeners, where can they find out more information? What are some good resources that they can go to after listening to this conversation today?
Well, thank you for that. And thank you for all those kind words. Obviously, the admiration is very mutual, because when I started the podcast and plantmedicine.org, I was on third wave every day looking up things. So you were definitely there in spirit while I was starting all of these things. And if people are interested, if you are a clinician and you're looking to join, or if you're an organization and you'd like to be a member, head over to psychedelicmedicineassociation.org and you can fill out the membership form there. If you are a patient and you would like your provider to know about psychedelics, tell them about us, say, hey, have you heard of psilocybin or MDMA or whatever, is your psychedelic of passion that you think may be helpful, and have them go to the Psychedelic Medicine Association. And $275 is the most anybody would pay, or they pay $0. We want everybody in there because we just want clinicians to be educated. And then if you'd like to listen to the podcast, the Plant Medicine Podcast is on all the podcast places, I believe. And on Instagram, we are Plant Medicine .org.
And are you on Instagram with the Psychedelic Medicine Association as well? Do you have social?
Technically, I mean, I think, and it's
okay.
It's so funny because what I think is going to work in social media landia is always surprising to me, because I'm like, okay, I'm making a professional medical association. I'll put an Instagram, but I don't think anybody's going to follow it. I've posted almost nothing, and I think we have 1,400 people already. So that one's, I can't explain it. I have 14 something thousand people on the other one, and all I've ever posted is nerdy science articles, and I've paid for nothing. So I don't know, the Instagram gods are fond of psychedelics, but that one is Psychedelic Medicine Association on Instagram, and the other one it's currently Plant Medicine .org. I may change it to Plant Medicine Podcast, but either way, you will find me there.
Great. Well, again, thank you so much, Lynn Marie, for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Paul.
Thanks so much for watching. If you want to stay up to date on the third wave of psychedelics, subscribe to this channel and visit thethirdwave.co, where you'll find plenty of free resources on intentional and responsible psychedelic use.